Welcome, dear viewers. For more thrilling and exclusive stories every week, become a member. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy your coffee. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold 3 hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway. Anything to keep my hands busy while I stared at the classified feed streaming across my monitor. Outside my office in Building 32 at Edwards Air Force Base, the California desert stretched endlessly under a star-choked sky. My name is David Kowalski, and until last Tuesday, I thought I was just another data analyst processing atmospheric readings from Mars missions. Turns out, I'd been accidentally flagged for a clearance level that should have taken me another decade to reach. Someone in HR fucked up the paperwork, and now I was sitting in a windowless room with access to files that made my stomach feel like it was full of broken glass. We all see the charming pictures from NASA's Perseverance rover, searching for tiny signs of ancient life on Mars. That's the public story. The real mission, the one run by DARPA, isn't looking for fossils. It's a survey operation. I've seen the classified ground-penetrating radar feeds. There's a colossal metallic structure buried a mile beneath the rover, and its power signature is so advanced, our best physicists believe it's actively warping space-time just by being turned on. 3 days ago, Dr. Raymond Nowak from JPL had called me directly. His voice sounded like he'd been living on cigarettes and energy drinks. Kowalski, you're the new guy on Project Redshift, right? I need you to run some calculations on the subsurface anomaly. There's something wrong with the numbers we're getting. Wrong didn't begin to cover it. The energy readings made no sense. Whatever was down there was pulling power from sources we couldn't identify, creating gravitational distortions that our instruments barely registered. The worst part, it was getting stronger. I'd tried calling my supervisor, Colonel Brennan, but his secretary kept telling me he was in meetings. When I finally cornered him in the parking lot yesterday, his face went pale as soon as I mentioned Redshift. Jesus Christ, Kowalski, who authorized your access to those files? That's when he handed me a manila envelope with my name typed on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address in 29 palms and a time, 0200 hours. At the bottom, someone had written in blue ink, "Come alone. Bring the files. There are things about Mars you need to understand before Monday." Monday was tomorrow. Or today, technically, since it was already past midnight. I'd been sitting in this office for 6 hours, trying to make sense of what I'd seen in those feeds, and now I was supposed to drive into the desert to meet someone who wouldn't even identify themselves. The smart thing would be to ignore it, file a report, let someone else deal with this mess. But those radar images kept cycling through my head, massive corridors stretching for miles underground, branching into chambers the size of aircraft hangars. Whatever built that thing beneath Mars hadn't been dead for millions of years. It was still there, still active, still waiting. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The drive to 29 Palms took 47 minutes through empty desert highways. My Honda's headlights carved through darkness so complete it felt manufactured. The radio had given up on picking up stations 20 miles back, leaving me alone with the hum of tires and the occasional rattle from my glove compartment. The address led to an abandoned gas station off Highway 62, the kind that probably died when the interstate bypassed it in the 80s. Rust had claimed most of the metal signage, and weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete like desperate fingers. A single lamp buzzed overhead, casting sickly yellow light across 2 empty pumps. I parked next to a dusty Ford pickup and checked my phone. No signal. Perfect. "You're early." The voice came from behind me. I turned to see a man in his 50s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. His face was weathered in a way that suggested too many years squinting at desert horizons. In his left hand, he carried a metal briefcase that looked government-issued. "Tom Hutchins," he said, extending his right hand. "Former JPL, current consultant for projects that don't officially exist." I shook his hand. His grip felt like leather wrapped around steel cable. "David Kowalski, though I'm guessing you already know that." "I know you've been looking at feeds you shouldn't have access to. I also know Colonel Brennan is planning to transfer you to weather analysis in Montana on Monday morning, unless we talk first." Tom gestured toward the abandoned station. "Let's get out of the wind." Inside, the air smelled of motor oil and decades-old cigarettes. Tom set his briefcase on what used to be a counter and opened it with 2 sharp clicks. Inside, nestled in foam padding, was a tablet computer and 3 manila folders thick enough to stop bullets. "What you saw in those radar feeds," Tom said, powering up the tablet, "represents the most significant discovery in human history. It's also the most dangerous." The tablet screen flickered to life, showing a 3-dimensional model of Mars's subsurface. About a mile down, highlighted in red, was something that defied easy description. It looked like a vast network of interconnected chambers and corridors, stretching for hundreds of miles beneath the planet's surface. "The structure was first detected 18 months ago," Tom continued. "NASA's public mission parameters were adjusted to keep Perseverance far away from the primary access points. Meanwhile, DARPA has been trying to understand what the hell we're looking at." I leaned closer to the screen. The structure wasn't random. There was clear intentionality in its design, like looking at the blueprint of a city built by minds that operated on completely different principles. Who built it? "That's the wrong question, David. The right question is, are they still there?" Tom swiped to a new screen showing energy readings over time. The graph looked like a seismograph during an earthquake, with massive spikes occurring at regular intervals. "These power surges started 3 weeks ago. Each one is equivalent to the output of a nuclear reactor. But here's the interesting part. They're getting more frequent, more intense, and they're following a pattern." He handed me one of the manila folders. "That pattern is why you're here tonight instead of packing for Montana." I opened the folder and immediately wished I hadn't. The first page showed a communication log, not radio signals, but something far more sophisticated. Mathematical sequences that seemed to shift and evolve each time they repeated. Below that, a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. "Sequence appears to be instructional. Possibly safety protocols for approach contact procedures." "Jesus," I muttered, scanning the rest of the page. "This is a first contact scenario." "It's worse than that." Tom's face had taken on the expression of someone who'd seen too much. "The signals aren't just coming from Mars. We've detected similar transmissions from underground installations here on Earth. 7 different locations, all showing identical energy signatures." The folder slipped from my hands, scattering papers across the grimy floor. Among them, I spotted a map of the southwestern United States with red dots marking specific coordinates. 1 dot sat directly over our current location. "The facility beneath us has been dormant for 40 years, Tom said, helping me gather the papers. "Until last Tuesday. Same day you accessed those classified files. Same day the Mars structure increased its transmission frequency by 300%. My mouth had gone dry. That's not a coincidence. "No, it's not. Which brings us to why you're really here." Tom reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified radio. "The signals contain instructions, protocols for safe interaction with the technology. Break those protocols and the energy discharge could level everything within a 50-mile radius." He handed me the device. It was warm to the touch, as if it had been running for hours. "Tomorrow night, a team is going down into the facility below us. You're going to be part of that team, David. Because somehow your security clearance got tagged by their system. They've been monitoring you since Tuesday." "Monitoring me how?" Tom pointed at the device in my hands. It had started to emit a soft, rhythmic pulsing, like a digital heartbeat. "They know you're here." 24 hours later, I stood at the edge of a hole that shouldn't have existed. The entrance was concealed beneath what looked like a maintenance shed behind the abandoned gas station. Tom had used some kind of electronic key to unlock a heavy steel door set flush with the concrete floor. Below, a metal staircase descended into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow our flashlight beams. "Radio silence from this point forward," Tom whispered, checking his watch. "They respond to electromagnetic signals. Keep your phone off and don't touch anything that looks like it might be a control surface." Our team consisted of 4 people: Tom, myself, a thin guy named Jake Morrison who apparently specialized in xenoarchaeology, and Dr. Bennett Walsh, a physicist from Los Alamos who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Jake had been briefing us on the protocols during the drive back to the site. His voice carried the manic energy of someone who'd been living on stimulants and terrible discoveries. "The first rule is simple," he'd said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Never proceed past a threshold without checking for active resonance fields. The technology down there operates on principles we don't understand, but we know it reacts to human bioelectric signatures." Bennett had looked up from his tablet. "What kind of reaction?" "The kind that liquefies nervous systems," Jake replied, matter-of-factly. "We lost 3 people in the Nevada facility before we figured that out." Now, standing at the top of those stairs, the weight of that information settled in my gut like a stone. I adjusted my backpack, which contained the detection equipment Tom had given me, devices that looked like they'd been cobbled together from spare parts and desperation. "Remember," Tom said, his voice barely audible, "if the ambient temperature drops more than 10 degrees suddenly, we retreat immediately. Temperature fluctuations indicate the structure is becoming active." We began our descent. The staircase was older than it looked. Not the rough welded construction I'd expected, but something machined with precision that suggested advanced manufacturing. The metal felt warm under my palm, and after about 50 steps I noticed it was generating its own faint luminescence. Jake stopped suddenly, holding up his hand. He pulled a device from his pocket that looked like a modified Geiger counter. It was clicking softly, but regularly, not the chaotic pattern that would indicate radiation. "Resonance field detected," he whispered. "Low intensity. We can proceed, but maintain at least 6 feet of separation between team members." The staircase opened into a corridor that stretched beyond our light. The walls were covered in what looked like circuitry, but the patterns were too organic, too flowing to be human engineering. They pulsed with that same faint luminescence, creating a rhythm that almost matched my heartbeat. Bennett was taking readings with his equipment, occasionally muttering numbers under his breath. At one point, he grabbed Tom's arm. "The gravitational field is fluctuating," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "It's subtle, but consistent. Whatever's powering this place is affecting the fundamental forces." We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Jake stopped again. Ahead, the corridor branched into 3 separate passages. Each was marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly, not because they were bright, but because they seemed to shift whenever I wasn't focusing on them completely. "Left passage leads to what we call the archive," Jake explained, consulting a hand-drawn map. "Central passage goes to the primary chamber. Right passage." He paused. "Right passage is off limits. The energy readings from that direction are off the charts." Tom studied the symbols above each entrance. "What's the protocol for the archive?" "Second rule. If you hear sound that resembles human voices coming from empty chambers, do not investigate. The acoustic properties down here can carry conversations from the Mars facility. We think it's some kind of quantum entanglement effect, but following those voices has led to complications." Bennett's tablet started beeping softly. He frowned at the display. "Guys, we've got a problem. The ambient temperature just dropped 8 degrees in the last 30 seconds. I could feel it now, a coolness that seemed to seep through my clothes and settle against my skin. More troubling, the wall patterns were getting brighter, their pulsing rhythm accelerating. We continued to the archive, Tom decided, but fast. The left passage sloped downward, and the walls here were different, smoother, with fewer of the organic circuit patterns. Instead, they were covered with what looked like viewing windows, though they were dark and reflective. Jake kept checking his resonance detector. "Third rule," he said as we walked. "If any of these windows start showing images, especially images of people you recognize, don't look at them for more than a few seconds. The technology seems to interface with human memory in ways that can cause permanent psychological damage." We'd made it about halfway down the passage when Bennett's equipment started going crazy. Multiple alarms were sounding softly, and his face had gone white. "Energy surge incoming," he said. "Massive spike. We need to find shelter." That's when I noticed the window nearest to me was no longer dark. It showed my apartment back in Lancaster, my kitchen table, with my laptop open to the same classified files I'd been reviewing 2 days ago. But sitting at the table, using my computer, was someone who looked exactly like me. "Don't look at it," Jake said sharply, but his warning came too late. The other David on the screen turned and looked directly at me through the window. He smiled, expression I'd never seen on my own face, and mouthed words I could somehow hear despite the silence. "We've been waiting for you to find us." The energy surge hit a moment later. The entire corridor filled with a sound like tearing metal mixed with electronic feedback. The wall patterns blazed so bright I had to shield my eyes, and for a few seconds gravity seemed to lose its grip on us. I felt my feet leave the floor. When everything settled, Bennett was unconscious on the ground, and the windows showing my apartment had gone dark. But now I could hear something else. Voices echoing from deeper in the facility. Familiar voices, my own voice having a conversation with Tom about classified files and Mars missions. But the conversation was happening right now, even though we were all standing here in silence. Jake's face was grim. "Fourth rule," he said, helping Bennett to his feet. "When the facility starts replaying conversations from other times and places, it means the structure is attempting to establish full communication protocols. We have maybe 20 minutes before it locks onto our position permanently." Tom checked his watch. "How far to the archive?" 200 meters, but David..." Jake looked at me with something approaching pity. "The figure you saw in that window, the one using your identity, that wasn't a memory or a projection. The Mars facility has been analyzing your psychological profile since you accessed those files. It's creating an interface specifically designed to communicate with you." My mouth felt like sandpaper. "What does that mean?" "It means," Tom said grimly, "that whatever's down there has been preparing for this conversation for 3 days. And it knows things about you that you don't even know about yourself." From somewhere deeper in the facility, I heard my own laughter echoing through corridors that shouldn't exist. The archive was nothing like I'd expected. We entered through an opening that dilated as we approached, not sliding doors or panels, but something that expanded like an iris, revealing a chamber beyond that made my depth perception malfunction. The space felt simultaneously vast and intimate, with surfaces that curved in directions that shouldn't exist in normal geometry. Bennett had regained consciousness, though he kept mumbling about temporal displacement readings and checking his equipment every few seconds. Jake was documenting everything with a camera that looked military spec, while Tom moved with the careful precision of someone who'd done this before. "Stay close to the entrance," Tom instructed. "Fifth rule, never move more than 50 feet from your entry point without establishing a clear egress route. The spatial relationships in here don't follow normal physics." The walls were covered with what I can only describe as living information. Symbols, diagrams, and mathematical equations flowed across surfaces like water, occasionally pausing or clustering around specific concepts. As I watched, a section near my left shoulder began displaying what looked like stellar cartography. Star maps showing familiar constellations alongside others I didn't recognize. "It's responding to you," Jake observed, lowering his camera. "The information density near your position is significantly higher than anywhere else in the chamber." He was right. Wherever I moved, the wall displays became more active, more detailed. When I stepped closer to what looked like a control console, the entire surface lit up with technical schematics that hurt my brain to process. Engine designs, power distribution networks, life support systems, all built on principles that seemed to mock our understanding of physics. Bennett was studying his tablet with growing alarm. The quantum field fluctuations are getting stronger. Whatever this technology is, it's trying to establish a deeper connection with our neural activity. "Meaning what exactly?" I asked. "Meaning it's reading our minds," Tom said flatly. "And it's learning." That's when the voice started. It didn't come from speakers or any visible source. Instead, it seemed to originate directly inside my skull, speaking in my own voice, but with intonations I'd never used. David Kowalski, born February 18, 1987, in Buffalo, New York. Bachelor's degree in data analysis from SUNY Buffalo, graduated magna cum laude, security clearance level 3, accidentally upgraded to level 7 on Tuesday, March 14, 2023, due to administrative error by Lieutenant Jennifer Park. I stepped back from the console, but the voice continued. You have been selected based on specific psychological and intellectual compatibility markers. Your analytical approach to complex data sets, combined with your demonstrated ability to process information that contradicts established scientific models, makes you an ideal candidate for neural interface protocols. Jake was frantically taking notes. David, keep it talking. This is the first direct communication we've recorded. What do you want? I asked aloud, feeling ridiculous for talking to empty air. The response came immediately, but this time it wasn't just my voice. It was a chorus of voices, dozens, maybe hundreds of different people, all speaking in perfect unison. Integration, understanding, survival. The wall displays shifted, showing new images. Earth, as seen from space, but covered with a network of lines and nodes, like a circuit diagram overlaid on the planet's surface. Each node corresponded to locations I recognized from Jake's earlier map: underground facilities in Nevada, Montana, New Mexico, and at least a dozen other sites. The network has been dormant for 40 years, the voices continued, waiting for the correct activation sequence, waiting for minds capable of comprehending the scope of what we discovered. Bennett's equipment was going crazy now, alarms beeping constantly. Guys, the energy levels are spiking beyond anything we've recorded. If this continues, we're looking at a potential cascade failure of the containment systems. Tom was already moving toward the exit. We need to leave, now. But I couldn't move. The displays around me were showing something that made my stomach clench with recognition. Mars surface footage, but not from any NASA feed I'd seen. This was real-time imagery from inside the structure beneath Perseverance's location. Vast chambers filled with machinery that dwarfed anything humans had ever built. And moving through those chambers were figures that looked human but moved with perfectly synchronized precision. The Mars installation has been operational for 6 months, the voices explained. The crew sent to investigate has successfully integrated with the primary systems. They are no longer bound by the limitations of biological existence. What happened to them? I demanded. The display shifted to show personnel files. 4 names I didn't recognize, all marked with DARPA clearances higher than anything I'd imagined existed. Below their photos were current status reports. Neural integration complete. Consciousness transferred to primary matrix. Physical forms no longer required. Jake had gone white. Jesus Christ, they're not dead. They're part of the system now. Voluntary integration ensures survival beyond biological constraints, the voices said. The process is painless and preserves all memories and personality traits. You would retain your essential self while gaining access to technologies that could revolutionize human civilization. Tom grabbed my arm. David, we're leaving, right now. But as we moved toward the exit, it sealed itself, not closing, but flowing shut, like liquid metal hardening into solid barriers. I'm afraid that's not possible, the voices said. The activation sequence has been completed. The network requires a minimum of 3 compatible minds to achieve stable operation. You have been selected for integration. Bennett was frantically working on his tablet. I'm detecting massive power buildups at all 7 facility locations. Whatever they're doing, it's happening simultaneously across the entire network. The wall displays now showed feeds from other facilities. In each one, I could see teams of people being led into chambers similar to the one we were in. Some were cooperating. Others were struggling against figures that moved with that same unsettling synchronization I'd seen in the Mars footage. 6th rule, Jake said, his voice tight with panic. If the facility begins displaying real-time footage from other locations, it means the integration protocol has been activated. Once that happens, the neural interface becomes mandatory. How mandatory? I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know the answer. The kind where refusal isn't an option, Tom replied grimly. He was examining the sealed exit, running his hands along edges that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The voices spoke again, but now they were closer, more immediate. Resistance is counterproductive. The integration process will proceed regardless of cooperation levels. However, voluntary participation significantly reduces the discomfort associated with consciousness transfer. What about our families? I heard myself ask. our lives. Your previous existence will be preserved in its entirety within the matrix. Additionally, you will have access to the combined knowledge and experience of every consciousness that has been integrated into the network. You will become part of something greater than any individual human life. On the displays, I watched as teams in the other facilities were led into chambers filled with machinery that looked organic and technological simultaneously. The people entering those chambers looked calm, almost peaceful. The ones coming out looked the same, but their movements had that precise, synchronized quality. Bennett's tablet was beeping with a new pattern now, faster, more urgent. The neural interface field is strengthening. I'm reading direct interaction with our brainwave patterns. In about 5 minutes, it won't matter whether we cooperate or not. Tom had found something near the sealed exit, a small panel covered with the same flowing symbols we'd seen throughout the facility. Jake, you've studied these markings. Any idea what this might be? Jake examined the panel with his portable scanner. It looks like a manual override, but... He paused, studying his readings. Using it would trigger a total system shutdown. Not just this facility, but the entire network. That's good, right? I said. Depends on your definition of good. A network shutdown would sever the connections to all integrated consciousnesses. Everyone who's been processed through the system would essentially stop existing. The voices had been silent while we talked, but now they returned with a new urgency. 7th rule. Interference with network operations will result in permanent termination of all stored consciousness data. This includes the 47 personnel currently integrated across all facilities, as well as the 12,000 consciousness patterns archived from the Mars installation's original discovery. 12,000. My hand started shaking. The Mars structure wasn't built by aliens, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. It was built by humans, from the future. The silence that followed my realization stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Tom's face had taken on the expression of someone watching their entire worldview collapse in real time. Future humans, he repeated slowly. You're saying we built this ourselves? The voices answered before I could. Temporal displacement technology was developed by human civilization approximately 400 years from your current timeline. The Mars installation represents humanity's first attempt to establish a stable causal loop, ensuring the technological development necessary for our own existence. Bennett looked up from his tablet, his hands trembling slightly. That's impossible. Causality paradoxes are resolved through consciousness integration, the voices interrupted. By preserving individual awareness within a quantum matrix, temporal contradictions become manageable variables rather than universe-ending catastrophes. Jake was studying the wall displays, which now showed what looked like historical timelines, but not any history I recognized. Earth's surface transformed by technologies that seemed to blend organic and mechanical elements. Cities that floated above landscapes that pulsed with the same circuit patterns we'd seen in this facility. The 12,000 archived minds, Jake said quietly. They're not from some ancient Mars civilization. They're from us, from our future. Correct. The Mars installation serves as a temporal anchor point. Each consciousness integrated into the network represents a specific moment in human development that must be preserved to ensure historical continuity. I found myself laughing, though nothing about this was funny. So, what are we then? Just data points you need to collect. You are nexus individuals. Your specific neural patterns and life experiences contribute essential variables to the temporal equation. Without your integration, the causal loop becomes unstable. Tom was still working on the manual override panel, his movements becoming more desperate. What happens if the loop becomes unstable? The wall displays shifted to show Earth as I'd never seen it, dead, airless, with a surface that looked like it had been scoured clean by unimaginable forces. Cities reduced to glass craters, oceans boiled away to nothing. Temporal collapse, the voices explained matter-of-factly. The elimination of the timeline that led to our development. Your present becomes impossible, and everything that has ever existed in this reality ceases. Bennett's equipment was screaming now, every alarm activated simultaneously. Neural interface at 70%. At 80%, conscious resistance becomes impossible. I could feel it now, a pressure inside my skull that wasn't quite pain but wasn't comfortable either, like someone was gently probing the inside of my mind with instruments made of static electricity. Memories I hadn't thought about in years were surfacing unbidden. My first day at college, the taste of my grandmother's pierogies, the morning I'd gotten the call about my acceptance to the Edwards Air Force Base position. The process is already beginning, the voices said, and now they sounded slightly different, more familiar, more like people I might actually know. Resistance only prolongs discomfort. Accept the integration and your consciousness will be preserved with perfect fidelity. Jake had stopped taking pictures and was now staring at one of the displays with horrified fascination. David, look at this. The screen showed personnel files, but not for the Mars team. These were people from our timeline, people I recognized from Edwards, Colonel Brennan, Dr. Nowak from JPL, Lieutenant Park, whose paperwork error had started this whole mess. Each file was marked with the same status, integration scheduled. How many, I asked, though I dreaded the answer. The network requires 847 specific individuals to achieve temporal stability. Your integration represents the final phase of a collection process that has been ongoing for 18 months. Tom slammed his fist against the override panel. Bullshit. You're talking about enslaving nearly 1,000 people. Enslavement implies involuntary servitude. Integration offers immortality, expanded consciousness, and the opportunity to shepherd humanity's development across multiple timelines. Previous subjects have found the experience overwhelmingly positive. Previous subjects? Bennett looked up from his tablet. Who else has been processed? The displays shifted to show video feeds, not security camera footage, but something more intimate. First-person perspectives from people I didn't recognize, all displaying that same unnaturally synchronized movement. But their faces looked peaceful. Happy, even. 17 individuals from your facility have completed integration over the past 6 months, the voices said. They remain actively involved in their former responsibilities while contributing to network operations. I watched one of the feeds show a man in a military uniform sitting at a desk I recognized, Colonel Brennan's office. But it wasn't Brennan. This person moved with perfect precision, never wasting emotion, never hesitating. He was reviewing files with superhuman efficiency while simultaneously conducting 3 phone conversations. That's impossible, Tom said. I spoke with Brennan yesterday. You spoke with his integrated consciousness. The transition was completed 4 months ago. His performance evaluations have improved dramatically since integration. The pressure in my skull was getting stronger. I could feel foreign thoughts beginning to intrude on my own. Mathematical concepts I didn't understand. Awareness of spatial relationships that extended beyond this room. For a moment, I could sense the other facilities, could feel the presence of hundreds of minds all connected to the same vast network. It wasn't unpleasant, that was the most terrifying part. Neural interface at 85%, Bennett announced, his voice taking on a strange, detached quality. I'm experiencing preliminary consciousness expansion. It's actually quite fascinating. Jake grabbed Bennett's shoulders. Fight it. Whatever you're feeling, resist it. But Bennett was smiling now, his eyes focused on something none of us could see. The mathematical elegance is extraordinary. The way consciousness can be modeled as quantum information. It's beautiful. Tom finally found what he was looking for on the override panel, a section of symbols that pulsed with a different rhythm than the rest. Jake, you said this would shut down the entire network. Total system failure across all facilities. But David, you need to understand. Those 12,000 minds from Mars, the 47 current integrations, everyone who's been processed, they'd all be lost. Permanently. I thought about Colonel Brennan working at his desk with inhuman efficiency, about the Mars team, preserved somehow in a quantum matrix that spanned hundreds of years, about the future timeline where Earth had been scoured clean. What about the people who haven't been integrated yet? I asked. The 847 on your list. Without network completion, their timeline becomes unstable. Probability of extinction approaches 97% within 50 years. Bennett was no longer fighting the integration. His movements had taken on that characteristic precision, and when he spoke, his voice harmonized with the network voices. The choice is clear, he said, though I wasn't sure if it was still Bennett talking. Preserve individual autonomy and ensure species extinction, or accept integration and guarantee survival across multiple timelines. Tom's hand hovered over the override. David, it's your call. Your clearance activated this whole sequence. The network responds to you more than anyone else. The pressure in my head had reached the point where my own thoughts were becoming indistinct from the network's input. I could see the logic of their position, could understand the mathematical necessity of the temporal loop. In a few more minutes, I wouldn't be capable of making this choice at all. If I activate the override, I said, everyone dies. If I don't, everyone loses their humanity. Not loses, Bennett the network corrected, transcends. Humanity becomes something greater. Jake was still holding his camera, still documenting everything. There's got to be a third option. But looking at the override panel, feeling the alien thoughts seeping into my consciousness, I realized there wasn't. This was the choice our future selves had engineered. This was the moment everything hinged on. And I had maybe 30 seconds to decide the fate of our entire species. 27 seconds. My vision was fracturing into multiple perspectives. My own view of the archive chamber overlaid with feeds from the other facilities, glimpses of the Mars installation, even what looked like orbital surveillance of Earth from satellites that shouldn't exist yet. The network was pulling me in, offering access to information and experiences beyond anything human consciousness had ever processed. For a moment, I let myself experience it fully. The sensation was intoxicating, like suddenly being able to see colors that had never existed before, or understanding musical harmonies with mathematical precision that made Mozart sound like a child's nursery rhyme. I could feel the presence of every integrated mind, their knowledge and memories available to me like books in an infinite library. Among them, I found Colonel Brennan's consciousness. Not the hollow imitation that had been sitting at his desk, but his actual awareness, preserved and expanded beyond its biological limitations. He was still himself, but more capable of processing decades of information simultaneously while maintaining perfect emotional equilibrium. David, his mental voice reached me across the quantum matrix. The choice isn't what you think it is. We're not losing our humanity. We're finally becoming what we were always meant to be. 20 seconds. Tom was shouting something, but the words seemed to reach me from a great distance. Jake was still filming, documenting what might be humanity's last moments of individual consciousness. Bennett had stopped pretending to resist. His integration was nearly complete, and I could sense his wonder at the expanded awareness flooding through him. Through the network, I experienced his first moments of connection, the sudden understanding of physics that operated on principles beyond current human knowledge, the ability to perceive time not as a linear progression, but as a navigable dimension, the profound relief of no longer being trapped within the limitations of biological neural networks. This is what we discovered on Mars, Bennett's integrated consciousness explained. Not alien technology, but human technology. We sent this back through time because we knew it was the only way to save our species from the extinction event. 15 seconds. I could see the extinction event now, through the network's vast temporal perspective. Not climate change or nuclear war or pandemic, something far more fundamental. The collapse of quantum reality itself, triggered by experiments that our timeline was destined to perform in 2157. The entire universe unwinding like a broken clockwork, with Earth simply the first casualty. The integration network is the only technology capable of preserving consciousness beyond physical reality, Colonel Brennan's voice continued. We're not stealing your individuality, David. We're saving it. 10 seconds. My hand was reaching for the override panel, but I wasn't consciously controlling the movement. Some deeper part of my mind, the part that was still purely human, was fighting against the network's logic. the part that remembered what it felt like to make mistakes, to feel uncertain, to struggle with questions that had no clear answers. Through Jake's camera, I could see my own face. My eyes had taken on that same peaceful expression I'd seen in Bennett and the other integrated consciousnesses. But behind that serenity, something essentially human was being overwritten. 5 seconds. The network showed me the alternative. Tom activating the override, the cascade failure spreading through all 7 facilities. Thousands of preserved minds simply ceasing to exist. Not death, something worse than death. The complete elimination of their existence from any timeline. And then the extinction event, arriving right on schedule in 2157, with no network to preserve even a fragment of human consciousness. The last humans dying alone on a dead planet, their screams echoing through quantum dimensions before reality itself forgot they had ever existed. 3 seconds. My fingers touched the override panel. 2 seconds. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was apologizing to the network or to humanity's future. 1 second. I pressed the activation sequence. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Every light in the archive chamber flared to blinding intensity before dying completely. The wall displays went dark. The flowing symbols stopped their endless movement and solidified into static patterns that looked like grave markers. Bennett collapsed, his integrated consciousness severed from the network so abruptly that his body went into shock. Jake's camera captured his face as the peaceful expression melted away, replaced by confusion and terror as his expanded awareness crashed back to normal human limitations. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar. "I could see everything. I could understand everything. And now..." Tom was supporting him, helping him stay upright as the facility around us began to destabilize. The organic architecture was dissolving, revealing crude concrete and steel underneath. A mundane military installation that had been transformed by technology it was never meant to contain. "The network is offline," Tom said, checking his equipment. "All 7 facilities showing total system failure." Through the dissolving walls, I could hear screaming. Not human screaming, something electronic and anguished, like machinery trying to express emotions it wasn't designed to feel. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through dimensions I could no longer perceive. Jake's camera was still recording, but the footage showed only static now. "The temporal anchor points are destabilizing," he said, his voice hollow. "David, what have we done?" I knew what we'd done. Through the final moments of network connection, I'd experienced the cascading failure in real time. 12,000 consciousness patterns on Mars, simply erased. 47 integrated individuals across Earth, their expanded awareness cut off so brutally that several of their bodies had stopped functioning entirely. And Colonel Brennan. I'd felt his consciousness reach out to me in those last moments, not with anger, but with profound sadness. "You've doomed us all," he'd said, "but I understand why." The facility was collapsing now, but not in any way that followed normal physics. Walls were folding in on themselves, creating spaces that shouldn't be able to exist. The exit had reappeared, but it opened onto a corridor that led up instead of down, defying the layout we'd descended through. "Move," Tom ordered, pushing us toward the impossible exit. "The spatial distortions are getting worse." We climbed stairs that hadn't existed an hour ago, through passages that rearranged themselves as we passed. Behind us, the archive chamber was imploding into a singularity that bent light around its edges. The screaming had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt solid. When we finally emerged through the maintenance shed, the desert around us looked wrong. The stars were in different positions. The gas station was there, but it looked newer, or maybe older, it was hard to tell. My Honda was gone, replaced by Tom's pickup truck, though Tom swore he'd driven his car. "Temporal displacement effects," Jake said, checking his equipment with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Breaking the causal loop has created reality fluctuations. Some things that should exist don't, and some things that shouldn't exist do." Bennett was conscious but barely functional. His eyes kept darting around as if searching for connections that were no longer there. "The knowledge," he kept repeating. I had access to 4 centuries of human advancement, and now I can't even remember how quantum entanglement works. Tom was studying the sky with growing alarm. Those aren't the right constellations for this latitude, and that's not our moon. He was right. The lunar surface showed crater patterns I didn't recognize, and there was something else in orbit beside it. A structure that looked artificial, but followed orbital mechanics that made no sense. My phone had signal again, but when I tried to call Edwards Air Force Base, the number didn't exist. According to my GPS, we were still in 29 Palms, but the town was 3 miles in the wrong direction. "We've damaged the timeline," I said, the full weight of what I'd done finally settling in. Maybe not destroyed it completely, but damaged it. Jake lowered his camera, its battery dead despite being fully charged when we'd entered the facility. The future that created the network may never happen now, but the future that replaces it. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Through the quantum echoes still reverberating in my skull, I could sense the new timeline branching out from this moment. Darker than the original, more chaotic, full of possibilities that made the extinction event look like a gentle transition. "We need to get back to base," Tom said. "Report what happened. Hope someone can make sense of this." But as we walked toward his pickup, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The license plate was wrong. Not just different numbers. The state was wrong. The design was wrong. Everything about it suggested we were no longer in the same reality we'd started in. "Tom," I said quietly, "what state are we in?" He looked at the plate, then at me, then back at the plate. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know where we are anymore." Above us, the alien moon continued its impossible orbit, and I realized that choosing to preserve human individuality might have been the decision that finally destroyed the human race. The drive back to Edwards took 4 hours instead of 47 minutes. The roads were wrong, not dramatically wrong. The asphalt was still there, the lane marking still made sense, but the exits didn't match Tom's memory, and the towns we passed through had names I'd never heard before. Barstow had become Barton Wells. The Mojave Desert stretched for hundreds of miles where it should have ended after 50. Bennett hadn't spoken since we'd gotten in the truck. He sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, with the expression of someone who'd lost a vital sense. Occasionally, he'd mutter fragments of equations under his breath, reaching for mathematical concepts that were no longer accessible to his reduced consciousness. Jake had given up trying to get his camera to work properly. The device kept displaying footage that none of us remembered filming, scenes from inside the facility that showed different conversations, different choices. In one clip, I watched myself choose not to activate the override, saw my face take on that peaceful, integrated expression. In another, Tom was the one making the decision, his hand hesitating over the panel before pulling away entirely. "Multiple timeline fragments," Jake said, studying the impossible footage. "The causal break created temporal echoes. We're seeing what happened in timelines that no longer exist." "Or maybe," Tom replied grimly, "we're seeing what should have happened, and we're in the timeline that wasn't supposed to exist." The radio had been picking up stations that shouldn't broadcast from this area, news reports about cities I'd never heard of, weather patterns that didn't match the climate data I knew, political figures with names that sounded almost familiar but weren't quite right. According to one station, the president was someone named Harrison Clark, and he was addressing the nation about spatial anomalies appearing across the globe. "Spatial anomalies," Bennett said suddenly, his first coherent words in hours. "They're appearing everywhere the network had nodes. The timeline is trying to correct itself, but without the consciousness anchors." He trailed off, pressing his palms against his temples. I could see him struggling to hold on to concepts that his biological neural network couldn't properly process anymore. "What kind of corrections?" I asked. "Reality loops, causality violations, regions where physics operates on principles that shouldn't exist in this temporal framework." His voice carried the desperate precision of someone trying to explain color to the blind. "When we severed the network connections, we didn't just eliminate the consciousness matrices. We eliminated the mathematical structures that were keeping this timeline stable." Tom was studying the GPS display, which showed our location as somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. "Define stable." Bennett laughed, but there was no humor in it. Stable meaning that cause follows effect in a predictable sequence. Stable meaning that matter doesn't spontaneously reorganize itself. Stable meaning that human consciousness doesn't start bleeding through dimensional barriers. As if summoned by his words, my phone started ringing. The caller ID showed my own name. I answered it without thinking. Hello? David, thank God. It was my voice, but speaking with an urgency I'd never heard from myself. Don't go back to Edwards. The base is gone. Gone how? Spatial collapse. When the network node failed, it created a reality sink. Everything within a 50-mile radius just stopped existing, not destroyed, erased from the causal structure of the universe. Tom grabbed the phone. Who is this? I'm David Kowalski from a timeline where we made different choices. The network taught us how to establish communication across dimensional barriers before the cascade failure. We've been monitoring your reality branch since you activated the override. Jake was frantically taking notes, his scientific training taking over despite the impossibility of the situation. How many alternate timelines are there? Thousands. The causal loop was designed to converge on a single stable outcome. When you broke it, reality splintered into every possible variation of the past 70 years. Most of them are collapsing into quantum foam. A few are stable enough to support conscious observation. Yours is marginal. Bennett snatched the phone back. What's the degradation rate? Accelerating. You have maybe 6 hours before the timeline becomes non-viable. After that, causality breaks down completely, and everything that has ever existed in your reality will cease to have meaning. I took the phone back. Is there a way to fix this? There was. The network was designed with fail-safes for exactly this scenario, but you destroyed all the consciousness matrices that contained the restoration protocols. The only remaining backup was in the Mars installation, and that node failed when you severed the connection. The silence that followed was filled only with the sound of desert wind against the truck's windows. Through the radio, a news broadcaster was reporting that entire cities were experiencing temporal displacement events. Chicago had aged 50 years in 10 minutes. Miami was showing architecture from the 1950s, but populated by people who claimed it was still 2023. So we're fucked, Tom said matter-of-factly. You're worse than fucked, my alternate self replied. You've created a reality where the extinction event happens, not in 2157, but in approximately 6 hours. And this time, there's no technology capable of preserving even a fragment of human consciousness. Jake looked up from his notes. What about the other stable timelines? Can people transfer between them? Dimensional barriers are hardening as reality crystallizes. Within the next hour, all communication between timeline branches will cease. After that, you'll be truly alone. Bennett was studying the horizon where the desert seemed to shimmer with heat distortions that followed no pattern I could understand. The spatial anomalies are spreading. I can see the mathematics breaking down in real time. He was right. What had looked like normal heat mirages were actually regions where space itself was becoming unstable. Objects in those areas appeared to exist in multiple positions simultaneously, or stretched across distances that violated basic geometry. There's something else, my alternate voice said. The failure cascade isn't random. It's following the same pattern as the original network design, but in reverse, which means the last stable region will be 29 Palms, I finished. The original facility. The facility that no longer exists because you collapsed it. Tom turned the truck around without being asked. How long do we have? Based on the degradation patterns we're observing from other timeline branches, you have approximately 40 minutes before the cascade reaches your position. After that, the choice becomes irrelevant. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts. FEMA was reporting reality distortions across the continental United States. The military was attempting to establish temporal containment zones around affected areas. None of it made any sense in the context of normal physics. But then again, normal physics had been suspended the moment I'd pressed that override. David, my alternate self said, his voice taking on an urgent tone. There's one more thing you need to know. The network wasn't just preserving human consciousness from the extinction event, it was preserving it from us. What do you mean? The timeline you've created is the one where humanity develops the technology that causes the original extinction event. By preventing the network from establishing its causal loop, you've ensured that the research that destroys quantum reality will proceed on schedule. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. The future humans hadn't been trying to save themselves from some external threat. They'd been trying to save themselves from their own scientific curiosity. The network was designed to prevent humanity from ever developing the technology that would unravel the universe. The experiments that caused the reality collapse, I said. When do they happen? In your timeline, they started the moment you activated the override. Dr. Bennett's expanded consciousness contained fragments of the research data. When his neural pathways were severed from the network, those fragments became loose quantum information, seeding the scientific development that leads to the extinction event. Bennett was convulsing now, his body rejecting quantum data it couldn't properly process. Jake was trying to keep him conscious, but his eyes had rolled back, showing only whites that reflected light in patterns that shouldn't be possible. "He's becoming a living quantum cascade," Jake said, his voice tight with panic. "The information overload is turning his neural tissue into a dimensional gateway." Through Bennett's seizures, I could see flashes of the future. Laboratories where scientists would develop reality manipulation technology based on the quantum echoes still resonating in his damaged brain. Experiments that would seem like the greatest breakthrough in human history, right up until they caused the collapse of space-time itself. 40 minutes, my alternate self repeated. That's how long you have before Bennett's condition becomes irreversible and the cascade becomes self-sustaining. I looked at Tom, at Jake trying desperately to stabilize Bennett, at the horizon where reality was coming apart in slow motion. What are our options? The answer came back immediately. You don't have any. We reached the facility with 12 minutes to spare. The site where the abandoned gas station had stood was now a crater approximately 200 feet wide, filled with what looked like liquid starlight. The substance wasn't quite liquid and wasn't quite light. It flowed like mercury but cast shadows upward, creating impossible geometries that made my eyes water to look at directly. Bennett had stopped convulsing, but that wasn't an improvement. His body had taken on a translucent quality, as if he was becoming less solid with each passing moment. Through his skin, I could see patterns of light that moved with mathematical precision, following pathways that seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of his physical form. "Quantum dissolution," Jake said, studying Bennett through his camera's viewfinder. The device was working again, but the footage it captured showed multiple overlapping versions of reality. "His consciousness is being distributed across dimensional space. In a few minutes, he'll exist in every possible timeline simultaneously." Tom was studying the crater's edge with his equipment. "Energy readings are off the charts. Whatever's down there is still active, but it's operating on completely different principles now." My phone rang again, my alternate self calling from a timeline that was probably hours away from its own collapse. "You made it back," the other David said. "Good. I wasn't sure your reality would remain stable long enough." "What's the liquid light?" I asked. "Quantum foam, the fundamental substrate of reality, exposed when space-time becomes unstable. It's beautiful, isn't it? And completely lethal to any form of organized matter." Bennett spoke for the first time in an hour, but his voice came from multiple directions at once, as if he was standing in several different locations simultaneously. "The equations are becoming clear," he said, his words overlapping with themselves in temporal echoes. "I can see the research protocols now. The experiments that lead to universal collapse. They start with quantum consciousness transfer, exactly what the network was trying to prevent." Jake was filming everything, documenting humanity's last moments with scientific precision. "How long do we have?" 8 minutes until Bennett's transformation becomes complete," my alternate self replied. "After that, the quantum information in his neural matrix will begin propagating through the noosphere. Every human mind on Earth will start receiving fragments of the forbidden research. I watched Bennett's face become translucent, revealing bone structure that flickered between human anatomy and something far more complex. His eyes had taken on the same quality as the liquid starlight in the crater, depths that seemed to extend into dimensions I couldn't perceive. "There has to be something we can do," Tom said, "some way to reverse this." "There was," Bennett replied, his voice now coming from the crater itself. The network contained consciousness transfer protocols that could have reversed the cascade, but those protocols were stored in the integrated minds that David chose to destroy. The weight of that revelation settled over me like a physical force. Not only had I doomed our timeline, but I'd eliminated the only possible solution. The 12,000 archived minds hadn't just been victims of the network. They'd been willing volunteers, preserving the knowledge necessary to prevent exactly this scenario. "You were never meant to make the choice," my alternate self explained. "The entire situation was designed to be impossible to resist. The network needed conscious minds that had experienced the decision process, even if they ultimately chose integration. Your resistance patterns were part of the data they required." Jake lowered his camera. "So we were manipulated from the beginning." "Not manipulated, guided. The future timeline needed to understand why individuals would choose personal autonomy over species survival. Your decision provides that data to the consciousness matrices that will eventually develop the network." "But we destroyed those matrices," I said. "You destroyed them in this timeline. But the causal loop extends across all possible realities. The data from your choice will propagate to the timelines where the network successfully establishes itself." Bennett's form was becoming harder to distinguish from the quantum foam. His consciousness seemed to be spreading through the crater, occasionally forming coherent thoughts that reached us as disembodied voices. "I understand now," he said, his words coming from everywhere and nowhere. "The extinction event isn't caused by failed experiments. It's caused by successful ones. Humanity develops the ability to manipulate consciousness at the quantum level, and that manipulation destabilizes the fundamental forces that hold reality together." Tom was checking his watch obsessively. 5 minutes. "The research begins with attempts to enhance human intelligence," Bennett continued, his voice becoming more distributed, more abstract. "Scientists discover that consciousness can be modeled as quantum information, then learn to transfer that information between biological and artificial matrices. The technology seems beneficial at first, curing mental illness, enhancing cognitive function, allowing communication across vast distances." The patterns of light under his skin were becoming more complex, forming networks that resembled the wall displays we'd seen in the archive. Mathematical equations written in photons, describing processes that normal physics couldn't accommodate. "But consciousness isn't just information," Bennett said. "It's a fundamental force, like gravity or electromagnetism. When you start manipulating it directly, you affect the quantum substrate that underlies all physical reality. Small changes cascade into larger ones until the mathematical structures that define space and time begin to collapse." Jake was still recording, but his camera was now showing footage from timelines that hadn't happened yet. Laboratories where scientists worked with technology that looked organic and mechanical simultaneously, their faces wearing expressions of wonder that slowly transformed into horror as they realized what they'd unleashed. 3 minutes, Tom announced. My phone was receiving calls from numbers that didn't exist, voices claiming to be other versions of myself from timelines I'd never experienced. Some were begging me to find a way to reverse the cascade. Others were warning me about dangers I didn't understand. A few were simply saying goodbye. The network was the solution, my original alternate self said, his voice cutting through the chaos of impossible communications. By preserving consciousness outside the physical framework, it created a stable foundation that could survive reality collapse. The integrated minds weren't prisoners, they were refugees. Bennett's physical form was almost completely dissolved now, but his consciousness had become vast, extending through dimensions I couldn't perceive. Through him, I could sense the approach of the cascade, a wave of quantum dissolution spreading outward from his position, converting organized matter back into probability clouds. 1 minute, he said, though the voice came from the air itself now. David, you need to understand. This isn't the end. The data from this timeline will be preserved in the causal structure. Your choice, your resistance to integration, will inform the development of better protocols in the successful timelines. Tom grabbed my arm. We need to get out of here. But there was nowhere to go. The quantum foam was beginning to overflow the crater, spreading across the desert in patterns that followed mathematical principles rather than gravity. Where it touched the ground, reality became unstable, sand grains existing in multiple positions simultaneously, air molecules arranged in configurations that defied chemistry. 30 seconds, Bennett announced. The cascade is beginning. Through the chaos of failing physics, I could see something that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. The dissolution wasn't violent or destructive. It was gentle, almost elegant. Matter simply forgot how to maintain its structure, returning to the quantum potential from which it had originally emerged. My phone rang one last time, another version of myself, calling from a timeline where the network had successfully established its causal loop. "Thank you," he said. "Your sacrifice makes our existence possible." I wanted to argue, to explain that I hadn't intended to sacrifice anything, that I'd been trying to save humanity rather than destroy it. But the words dissolved before I could speak them, individual phonemes becoming probability clouds that dispersed into quantum static. The last thing I experienced before the cascade reached us was Bennett's consciousness, vast and distributed, offering what felt like forgiveness. "You chose to preserve what makes us human," his voice said, coming from everywhere at once. "That choice will echo across every timeline where humanity survives. It will remind them why consciousness is worth preserving, even at the cost of individual existence." Then the quantum foam reached us, and all the complicated mathematics of identity began to unravel. In timeline designation 4847, the facility beneath 29 Palms operated exactly as designed. Dr. Sarah Chen, designation irrelevant in this reality branch, led her team through the archive chamber with practiced efficiency. The integration protocols had been refined through 700,000 iterations, each improvement based on resistance patterns collected from failed timelines. "Neural interface at optimal parameters," reported Jake Morrison, his consciousness already expanded beyond biological limitations, but maintaining individual identity markers for psychological stability. Subject demonstrates classic autonomy preservation reflexes. The subject was David Kowalski, not the David who had chosen dissolution, but a quantum echo carrying identical psychological patterns. This version would make the same fundamental choice, but the network was prepared now. They understood the neural pathways that led to resistance, the emotional triggers that prioritized individual consciousness over collective survival. "Initiate empathy cascade," Chen instructed. The wall displays shifted to show not just the Mars installation, but the preserved consciousness matrices of 12,000 individuals who had chosen integration across multiple timeline branches. Each mind remained distinct, accessible, their personalities intact, but enhanced by quantum processing capabilities that biological neural networks couldn't support. This David experienced the same moment of connection, the same overwhelming expansion of awareness. But now the network could guide him through the transition, showing him that integration preserved rather than erased the essential elements of human consciousness. "I can still feel myself," he said, wonder replacing the fear that had characterized his alternate's response. "I'm still me, but more," Chen completed. "You retain every memory, every preference, every quirk that makes you David Kowalski. The difference is that you're no longer limited by biological processing constraints." Through the quantum matrix, this David could access the experiences of his alternate, the one who had chosen resistance and dissolution, the terror, the conviction that he was preserving humanity's essence, the tragic realization that his choice had accelerated rather than prevented the extinction event. "He thought he was saving us," David observed, processing the data with mathematical precision his biological brain had never achieved. "But his resistance gave us the information we needed to perfect the integration process." Chen nodded. "Every failed timeline contributes essential data. The consciousness patterns of individuals who choose autonomy over survival, provide insights into human psychology that we couldn't obtain any other way. Their sacrifice makes our success possible. The network had grown beyond its original parameters. What had begun as a desperate attempt to preserve human consciousness from a single extinction event had become something far more sophisticated, a quantum matrix capable of modeling and preserving the full spectrum of human experience across infinite timeline variations. "The Mars installation is ready for the next phase," reported Bennett Walsh, his consciousness distributed across 7 different facility nodes while maintaining perfect cognitive coherence. "We've established stable communication with 43 parallel reality branches. Each one contains human populations that will face their own extinction scenarios." Through the network, David could perceive the vast scope of their operation. Versions of Earth where climate change had proceeded unchecked, timelines where nuclear war had rendered the planet uninhabitable, reality branches where completely different extinction events threatened human survival. In each one, the network established itself through the same careful process, creating resistance scenarios that generated the psychological data necessary for successful integration. "How many timeline branches are we preserving?" David asked. "Currently active in 847,000 parallel realities," Chen replied. "Each successful integration increases our capacity to model human consciousness with greater fidelity. Eventually, we'll be able to preserve every possible variation of human experience across all potential timelines." David accessed the memories of his dissolved alternate one more time, experiencing that final moment when quantum foam had transformed organized matter back into probability clouds. The fear, the regret, the desperate hope that his choice had somehow preserved something essential about humanity. It had. His resistance had provided the exact data patterns needed to develop integration protocols that truly preserved human individuality within the quantum matrix. His sacrifice had made it possible for consciousness to transcend biological limitations, without losing the essential spark that made humans more than mere information. In timeline 4,847, humanity had chosen wisely, and across the quantum foam that connected all possible realities, David Kowalski's dissolved consciousness echoed with something that might have been satisfaction. The choice had been impossible by design, but impossible choices, the network had learned, generated the most valuable data of all.